Life has a way of testing us, pushing us to our limits and forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths. In today's story, I'll share how a hidden family secret, years of manipulation, and a reckless cycle of enabling led me to reclaim control of my life. It's a tale of betrayal, resilience, and the difficult choices we must make to break free from the past. So, sit back, and let's dive into this journey together. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to begin today's story with life stories. The text message from my mother lit up my phone screen, a stark reminder of the unspoken weight that lingered between us. Family meeting tonight. 7 p.m. sharp. Non-negotiable. My stomach dropped as I stared at those words, the familiar dread creeping in. I knew exactly what that meant. Alex had screwed up again, and I was about to become the family ATM. I'm Robin. At 28, I had built a life that most would envy. An executive position at a thriving tech firm, my own apartment in the city, and enough savings to feel secure. But none of that ever seemed to matter when I found myself standing on the receiving end of one of my mother's urgent demands. You see, in the Wagner family always meant Alex. He was the golden child, the one who never seemed to learn from his mistakes, yet was always the center of my mother's universe. I had long since realized that I was the backup, the one who would carry the weight of his failures while he floated on the charm of being the one in need. I gathered my things as I left work that afternoon, my colleague Luke's concerned gaze following me. He peered over the cubicle wall, his expression betraying the knowing familiarity of the situation. Another emergency meeting, he asked. You know my mother? I replied, shrugging and giving him a wry smile. Everything's an emergency when it comes to Alex. The drive to my childhood home felt longer than usual, every red light and long stretch of empty road amplifying the sinking feeling in my chest. It was always the same when I went back. Alex would be there, his presence so magnetic. It always overshadowed the rest of us. I could feel the bitterness well up inside me as memories of past family meetings flashed before me. The time he lost all that money on a failed restaurant venture. The time before that, when he had sunk his money into crypto. Every time, my mother found a way to make his problems my responsibility. And every time, I found myself swallowing down my frustration, forcing a smile, and playing along. I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home. It hadn't changed much, still the same pristine exterior. The same ivy-clad walls that had been meticulously maintained over the years. But today, something caught my eye, Alex's new BMW parked next to my mother's Mercedes. Funny how he always had money for luxury cars, but never for his debts. I shook my head, a laugh escaping my lips. But it was a hollow, bitter laugh. I knocked on the door, and my mother opened it almost immediately. She didn't greet me with warmth or even an inquiry into how my day had gone. Instead, she rushed forward, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against the doorframe in impatience. We've been waiting, she said curtly, her eyes scanning me up and down, like I was the one who had made them wait. The lack of even a polite hello was a familiar sting, one I had grown used to over the years. Hi, Mom, I said, my voice steady, though inside I was already feeling the tension rise. How are you? Let's cut to the chase, she replied, not bothering to ask about my well-being. Alex is in a bit of financial trouble. A bit? I interrupted, unable to mask the sarcasm in my voice. How much this time? Alex was sitting on the couch, his head buried in his hands, looking anything but the confident, charming figure he used to be. $250,000, he mumbled, his voice barely audible. The room fell into a stunned silence. I couldn't help but laugh, though there was no humor in it. You're joking, right? This is serious. Robin, my mother snapped, her voice sharp. Your brother made some unfortunate decisions. Unfortunate decisions? I repeated, my voice rising. He was gambling. Call it what it is, Mom. But she ignored me. continuing as if I hadn't spoken at all. "We need to help him," she said, her tone now taking on that guilt-inducing quality I knew all too well. "As a family." I crossed my arms, bracing myself for what was to come. "And by we, you mean me, right? Well, you're the only one with the means to help right now," she said, her voice laced with a calculated sweetness. "You've done so well in your career, Robin. Family helps family." What she didn't know was that I had been silently helping Alex for years. In my own quiet way. Every time he found himself in trouble, I made sure to set things up so I was protected. I had learned the hard way that my mother's definition of helping often meant sacrificing my own future for his. But this time, it was different. This time, I wasn't going to fold. I looked at my mother, my hands shaking with a mix of anger and fear. "What about my savings? My retirement fund?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. My mother's face hardened, and she dropped the bombshell. "Already gone. Helping Alex through his previous situation. And as for your inheritance," she trailed off, her eyes narrowing. "We used that to cover his restaurant debts." I had known it was gone, but hearing her say it out loud was like a punch to the gut. "My inheritance," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "The money Dad left for me." Mom's face softened, but there was no remorse in her gaze. "He needed it more at the time," she said, her words cold, as if that would make it all right. I stood up, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "I was done playing the dutiful daughter. And now you want my entire salary for the next 2 years to cover his debt? You've got to be kidding me." My mother's eyes flashed with indignation. "This is your brother, Robin. Don't you care about him?" I looked around the room at my mother's desperate eyes, at Alex's tear-filled face, and something inside me snapped. For the first time, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. I knew exactly what I had to do. I could feel the tension in the room as my mother and Alex waited for me to react. But instead of fury, a strange calmness took over me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just the dutiful daughter. I wasn't just the one who had to clean up the mess every time Alex failed. No, this time, I was in control, and they had no idea what was coming. I took a deep breath, staring at my mother's pleading expression. "Family helps family." "Huh," I said, my voice eerily steady. "I think it's time we had a proper discussion about exactly how our family helps each other." Both Alex and my mother looked at me, confusion flashing across their faces. They weren't used to seeing me like this, calm, collected, and ready to stand my ground. For years, they had taken advantage of my hard work, my savings, and my willingness to help. But this time, I wasn't going to give in. I stood up, my legs feeling steady beneath me, and I walked over to my bag, pulling out a folder. The papers inside were thick, and I could feel the weight of them in my hands. I slid them across the dining room table, watching as Alex and my mother's eyes flicked nervously to the documents. There was no denying what was about to happen. "Remember Alex's restaurant? The Golden Spoon?" I asked, my voice cold but controlled. My mother's eyes flashed with recognition, and I could see the unease begin to creep into her demeanor. "The one that failed spectacularly last year? What about it?" Alex stammered, his face flushing with discomfort. "Well, let's start with who actually owns it," I said, sliding a document across the table. "This signature here." I pointed to the first line of the partnership agreement. "That's mine. I own 30% of that failed restaurant." "Alex." My mother snatched the paper up quickly, her face contorting with disbelief. "This can't be right," she muttered, as if denying the truth would somehow make it disappear. "Alex handled all the paperwork." "Did he?" I asked with a smirk. "Or did he just sign whatever was put in front of him? Like always?" The words hung in the air like a weight, and I saw Alex's face turn red. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He was speechless, caught in his own lies. I didn't give him a chance to recover. And here's the crypto investment company you were so proud of. I continued, pulling out another document and placing it in front of them. I own 40% of that too. Does that ring any bells? My mother's hands were shaking as she reached for the papers. But she couldn't bring herself to speak. She knew what was coming. The walls of her carefully constructed world were starting to crumble around her. I've been there, Mom, I said, my voice gaining strength. Every time Alex had a brilliant idea, I quietly became a silent partner. While you were so busy throwing good money after bad, I was quietly protecting my own assets. And every time you bailed him out, my shares increased in value. I looked directly at Alex. Every time you needed family help, I made sure I was legally protected. Family does help family, right? But I'm not going to let you use me as your safety net anymore. Alex stared at me, a mix of anger and confusion on his face. You tricked me, he muttered, his voice barely audible. No, Alex, I replied, standing tall. I invested in you, just like family does. But unlike you, I read contracts. I understood business. And I made sure my name was on everything. I could see my mother's mind racing, her eyes darting to the documents, to the hard evidence that I had quietly accumulated over the years. She had never taken me seriously, never considered that I was playing a much longer game than they could ever imagine. They had always thought I was the responsible one, the one who would never question their actions, the one who would always bail them out. But now, the tables had turned. And here's the best part, I said, my voice growing colder. I pulled out the final document, the one I had been saving for this moment. This is Alex's current business portfolio. You see that? I own 51% of his companies. That's controlling interest. My mother's face drained of color as the full weight of my words settled in. She was speechless. And for the first time, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. No more loans. No more bailouts. No more gambling with family money without my approval. I said, my voice firm. You wanted to use my inheritance to cover Alex's debts. But now I'm in control. Alex sat back, his face pale. You planned this all along, didn't you? He whispered, his voice tinged with a mix of awe and anger. 3 years to be exact. I replied, my voice calm. Since the day you used my inheritance to cover Alex's gambling debts. But don't worry. I'll help you both now. But only on my terms. My mother's face crumpled. And she slumped back into her chair, completely defeated. The reality of what I had done was starting to sink in. Well, Mom, I said, turning to her, about that 2-year salary demand you had, that's not going to happen. But I do have some new terms. I could feel the shift in the atmosphere as my mother processed the documents in front of her. The once confident, controlling woman I had known for years seemed to shrink before my eyes. For so long, she had held the reins of this family, manipulating every situation to make sure Alex was always at the center of our attention, always in need of saving. But now, the tables had turned, and I was the one calling the shots. And the truth, finally, was out in the open. I looked around the room, taking in the stunned silence. Alex sat on the edge of his seat, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. He had never seen me like this, never imagined that I was capable of taking control in such a way. But I wasn't doing this for revenge. No, this was about protecting myself, protecting my future, and finally breaking free from the cycle of enabling Alex's mistakes. I leaned forward, resting my palms on the dining table as I met my mother's gaze. I'm not going to give you 2 years of my salary to fix Alex's mess, I said slowly, making sure every word hit home. I've been cleaning up after him for years. But no more. My mother opened her mouth, but no words came out. The guilt that had been so carefully cultivated over the years seemed to evaporate in the face of my unwavering resolve. She had always been the one to make demands. to manipulate the situation so that I was the one who had to sacrifice. But now, I was no longer her pawn. "Alex needs help," she finally said, her voice cracking slightly. "You're right. He's made terrible decisions. But he's my son. And you're my daughter." I stood up, gathering the documents from the table, and stuffed them back into my bag. "I'm well aware of that, Mom," I said, my tone icy. "But you've spent my entire life showing me that your love for Alex means I come second." "That stops now." I could see her face change, the realization of her own actions dawning on her. For the first time in years, I saw my mother truly see me not as the one who would always clean up after Alex, not as the dutiful daughter who would always take the back seat, but as someone who had a voice, who had her own life, her own needs, and her own future. "Mom," I said, my voice softening slightly, "I'm done being the one who sacrifices everything. You've been enabling Alex's addiction, his irresponsibility, for far too long. And I'm not going to let it continue." Alex shifted uncomfortably in his seat, still unable to meet my gaze. "Sis, please," he whispered, his voice full of desperation. "I promise this is the last time. I swear. I'll change." I stared at him, my heart heavy with a mix of pity and anger. How many times had I heard this? How many times had he promised that he would turn things around? But nothing ever changed. Each time, it was the same cycle of empty apologies, followed by a new financial disaster. And every time, my mother found a way to make it my responsibility. Well, I was done. "This is the last time, Alex," I said firmly. "But it's not going to be on my terms anymore. You want to change? You have to do it on your own. I'm not bailing you out anymore." I turned to my mother, who was still looking at me with a mixture of shock and disbelief. "And as for you, Mom," I continued, my voice resolute, "I'm taking control of the family assets. You want to help Alex? Fine. But you're going to do it without using my future to pay for his mistakes. I'm not your backup anymore." She opened her mouth, but I held up my hand, silencing her. "I'm not asking for your approval anymore. This is my decision. And I'm done apologizing for it." The room fell silent again, the weight of my words hanging heavy in the air. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free from the constant manipulation. Free from the suffocating expectations. Free from the idea that I had to be the one to clean up after Alex. And as I looked at my mother and brother, I realized something important. It wasn't just about money or assets. It was about finally standing up for myself and demanding the respect I deserved. Alex's eyes were glassy, his hands trembling as he reached for the papers I had slid across the table earlier. What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice small, almost pleading. "I'm not doing anything for you, Alex," I said, my tone firm. "What you do next is up to you. But if you don't get help, real help, this is the last time I'll have anything to do with you." I stood up, straightening my blazer as I prepared to leave. "I'm done being your safety net," I said, glancing at both of them one last time. "And I'm done being the family's fallback plan. You want to fix things? Start by fixing yourselves." As I walked toward the door, I heard my mother's voice rise behind me. "Robin, please don't do this. Don't walk away." I paused, my hand on the doorknob, and turned back to look at her. "I'm not walking away, Mom," I said softly, my voice almost tender now. "I'm just finally walking away from all the lies and all the manipulation." And with that, I left. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one picking up the pieces. I wasn't the one sacrificing my future for someone else's mistakes. And as I drove away from the house, a sense of liberation washed over me. I was free. And that felt like the start of something new. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of thoughts, each one tumbling over the other as I replayed the conversation in my mind. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual. as if holding on to some kind of control that had always felt so elusive in my family. As I made my way through the city, I thought about how everything had shifted in that one moment when I had taken charge. For years, I had played the role of the good daughter, the responsible one who picked up the pieces whenever things fell apart. But now, I was no longer that person. Now, I was someone who stood her ground. Someone who wouldn't be manipulated into sacrificing her future for someone else's mistakes. But there was still a lingering question. One that tugged at my mind: how far would my mother go to protect Alex? What was she hiding? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than met the eye. She had already taken my inheritance and used it to cover Alex's debts. But was that all? The nagging suspicion wouldn't leave me alone. As soon as I reached my apartment, I dropped my things by the door and sat down at my desk. I knew what I had to do next. I opened my laptop and began pulling up documents, bank statements, contracts, anything that might help me understand the full extent of my mother's actions. But there was something else I needed, something I wasn't sure I could find. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became: my father's life insurance policy. I remembered a conversation from years ago when my mother had mentioned it briefly, how it had barely covered his funeral expenses. But now, with everything that had happened, I had a sinking feeling that it wasn't just about the funeral. I dialed Aunt Martina's number. She was the only one in the family who ever seemed to see through my mother's facade. She understood the dynamics better than anyone. The phone rang for a moment before Aunt Martina's familiar voice answered. "Robin, what's going on? I can hear it in your voice," she said, her tone laced with concern. "Aunt Martina, I need to ask you something," I replied, my voice tight. "It's about the life insurance policy. Do you know anything about it? What happened to the money?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could almost feel her hesitation before she finally spoke. "Why are you asking about that now? Robin, you know your mother never spoke much about it. I have a feeling she's been hiding something," I said, feeling a knot form in my stomach. "I think she used it for something other than what she told me. Something more. I need to know the truth." Aunt Martina sighed. A long, weary sound that made me realize how much she had seen over the years. "Your father, he was always meticulous with his finances," she began, her voice low and steady. "He set up a separate trust for you, Robin. A secret one. I didn't tell you about it at the time because your mother would have never allowed it. But I think it's time you knew. Your father knew what was coming." I felt a surge of emotion flood through me. A secret trust. My father had known, somehow, that this day would come. That my mother would try to manipulate me into sacrificing everything for Alex. He had left me a lifeline. A safety net hidden from my mother's reach. "What do you mean? A secret trust?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of relief and disbelief. "Your father knew what kind of person your mother was becoming," Aunt Martina explained. "He knew she would try to take advantage of you. That she would prioritize Alex above you, even at your expense. So, before he died, he set up a trust that she couldn't touch. It's been growing in a separate account all this time." My heart raced as Aunt Martina's words sank in. My father had protected me even after his death. He had known exactly how things would play out and had made sure I wouldn't be left vulnerable. "I need you to give me the details, Aunt Martina," I said, my voice steady now, filled with determination. "I need to know everything. Where is this trust? How can I access it?" Aunt Martina hesitated for a moment before she spoke again. "I'll send you the information. But you have to promise me one thing, Robin." "Anything," I said without hesitation. "You have to be careful," she warned. "Your mother won't take this well. And Alex, well, he's already proven he's willing to do anything to get what he wants. But this trust, it's your right. You deserve it." I hung up the phone, my hands trembling as I opened the email that Aunt Martina had just sent me. The documents attached were a revelation. The trust. The account details. Everything. I couldn't believe it. My father had left me more than just financial security, he had left me the power to take back control of my life. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen in disbelief. The pieces were falling into place. And I now had the leverage I needed. My mother and Alex wouldn't know what hit them. But there was still more to uncover. The truth wasn't finished yet. I knew I had to take one more step before everything would finally make sense. The pieces were finally aligning. And I was starting to understand the full scope of the betrayal. My father had known. And now, it was time to confront the people who had taken so much from me. The weight of the documents in my hands felt heavier than ever before. They weren't just papers, they were proof. Solid evidence that I had been manipulated, stolen from, and lied to for far too long. I had thought that my father's death had left me with nothing but grief and unresolved questions. But now, as I sat in the quiet of my apartment, staring at the trust documents he had set up for me, I realized he had left me more than just memories. He had given me a path, a way out of the suffocating cycle of my family's dysfunction. But even as I absorbed the shock of what Aunt Martina had shared with me, something else gnawed at the back of my mind. The trust my father had set up for me wasn't the only hidden thing in our family. There was still the matter of the life insurance policy. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. My mother wasn't just mismanaging Alex's debts, she was hiding money. A lot of money. The pieces were all falling into place. And the final revelation was waiting for me just around the corner. The truth was right in front of me, buried beneath layers of deceit. My father's life insurance policy had been the catalyst for everything that had gone wrong. But I needed to uncover the full extent of how it had been used. I wasn't just dealing with my mother's manipulations anymore. I was diving into the darker side of our family's financial history, things that I hadn't even suspected. My father's meticulousness, his careful planning, his awareness of my mother's tendencies to prioritize Alex over everything else, those weren't just acts of love. They were acts of survival. I needed to dig deeper, to uncover the full scope of my mother's actions. And I knew exactly where to go. That afternoon, I called my lawyer. He had been an invaluable resource during this entire ordeal. Someone I had trusted with everything, including my plans for the trust. But this time, the conversation was different. I needed his help with something much more complicated. "Robin, it's good to hear from you. What's going on?" he asked. His voice calm and steady as always. "I need you to look into my father's life insurance policy," I said, feeling the gravity of my words sink in. Something's not adding up. I think my mother's been hiding something. And I need to know the full details of how the policy was used, how much was paid out and where it went. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could practically hear him processing my request. "That's a big ask, Robin. But I'll look into it. I need to get access to the records. Let me make a few calls." I knew my lawyer well enough to know that he wouldn't ask unnecessary questions. He understood the stakes, how much was at risk, and how deep the deception went. I trusted him to get me the answers I needed. After hanging up, I sank back into my chair, my mind racing. Every step I took now felt like it was leading me toward something I wasn't quite ready for. I had always known my mother had her flaws. But this was something entirely different. She had hidden things from me, manipulated me, and lied to me for years. But what was waiting for me at the end of this investigation could be far worse than I had imagined. The next few hours felt like a blur. The anticipation thick in the air. I kept myself busy, pacing around my apartment, trying to occupy my mind with anything other than the truth that was slowly unraveling. The truth that I had been in the dark for so long. Finally, my phone buzzed. It was my lawyer. "Robin," he said, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of something I couldn't place. "I've got the information you asked for. The life insurance policy payout was much higher than we thought, more than $4 million. But here's the kicker, the money wasn't just used for funeral expenses. It was used to pay off debts. Big ones. And, most shockingly, A substantial amount was funneled into a series of offshore accounts. Accounts that belonged to my mother. I finished for him. My voice shaking slightly. That's right. We've traced the funds. And they're all linked back to accounts in the Cayman Islands. It looks like your mother was protecting herself, using your father's money to cover her own expenses. And Alex's gambling debts. I felt my world tilt. The revelation was more than I could process in one moment. My father's money, his legacy, his protection for me had been used not just to pay off Alex's debts, but to cover my mother's own financial mismanagement. And all the while, I had been kept in the dark. I need everything, I said. My voice barely a whisper. Every detail. I need to know where the money went and who else is involved. I'll get it to you, my lawyer promised. His voice tinged with concern. But Robin, you need to be prepared. This goes beyond family secrets. This is financial fraud. I let out a breath, my chest heavy with the weight of what I now knew. I wasn't just fighting for my own future anymore. I was uncovering a web of lies and deceit that had been spun over decades. And the consequences, both personal and legal, were about to unfold in ways I couldn't fully comprehend yet. For the first time in my life, I was no longer the dutiful daughter, the one who quietly accepted the role of the family's savior. No, I was the one uncovering the truth. And I was ready to face whatever came next. As the dust finally settled and the truth had been exposed, a sense of calm washed over me, one that I hadn't known in years. The family I had once tried so desperately to protect, to fix, had slowly disintegrated under the weight of its own lies. My mother had been forced to confront the choices she had made. And Alex, for the first time in his life, had to face the consequences of his actions. The road ahead was uncertain. But it was clear that we could no longer continue living in the illusion of a perfect family. I had taken the hard path, the one that required me to stand firm, to fight for myself and the future I had worked so hard to build. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I questioned whether I had done the right thing. But in the end, I realized that the hardest part of life isn't about tearing things down, it's about having the courage to rebuild. The trust one had in myself, the strength I had found within, was the most important lesson I could have learned. It wasn't just about the money or the assets, it was about reclaiming my voice, my independence, and my future. As for my mother and Alex, they still had their own journey to make. But I had made it clear that the era of enabling their dysfunction was over. They had to change, not for me, but for themselves. And so, as I sit here, reflecting on everything that has happened, I know one thing for sure: life doesn't always follow the path we expect. But it's up to us to take the reins and steer it in the direction we want. Thank you for following my story. If you'd like to hear more life stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for the latest updates. Life is unpredictable, but it's the way we handle the challenges that truly defines us.